My name is Nora, and I was 26 the last time I sat at my mother's Christmas table and realized I'd spent most of my life being treated like background decor. The shock wasn't that she still didn't see me. It was that I finally said one sentence she couldn't ignore. If you're listening right now, just tell me where you are and what time it is. I like knowing who's out there with me in the quiet. Anyway, that Christmas dinner didn't start like a revenge story. It started like every other one: warm food, forced cheer, and the same old family roles already assigned before anyone even sat down. I flew back to my hometown outside Rainier City after years of keeping my visits short and polite, because something in me wanted proof. Proof that I wasn't imagining the pattern, proof that I wasn't just too sensitive, proof that the little girl I used to be really had lived in a house where love had a ranking system. I didn't tell my mother, Denise, anything about my life beyond the safest version of it. I told her I was busy, that work was fine, that I could stop by for Christmas if she wanted. She replied faster than I expected, almost excited, and she added one line that told me nothing had changed. Miles will be here too. It'll be like old times. Old times. That phrase always sounded sweet to other people. To me, it sounded like a warning. I booked a hotel near the airport instead of staying at her house, and even that choice felt like a quiet rebellion. Like I was finally choosing a door that belonged to me. Christmas Eve was gray and wet, the kind of cold that doesn't bite. It just lingers. I checked into a clean room with no family photos and no childhood memories trapped in the walls, and I stood there for a moment just breathing, because I'd never realized how exhausting it was to sleep inside someone else's version of you. The next day, I drove a rental car through familiar streets that looked smaller than they did in my memory, past cracked sidewalks and a park that felt like it had been shrinking every year the same way my place in that family had. Denise's house still had that tired paint and the same overwatered lawn, except now it had cheap plastic reindeer out front, one of them bent like it had tried to stand up and failed. The door opened before I knocked. Denise was wearing her holiday apron, cheeks warm from the oven, the scent of turkey and cinnamon spilling out behind her like an invitation that wasn't really meant for me. She hugged me quickly, the way you hug someone you're trying to be polite to, and she stepped back to scan me like she was checking for changes she could comment on. "You look so grown," she said. And then, without pausing long enough for me to answer, she asked the only question she ever really asked about my life. "Work still going okay? Still doing that computer stuff?" I said yes, because the truth never had room to live inside that house. She nodded like she'd confirmed what she needed, and then she immediately brightened, the way she always did when she was about to talk about my brother. "Miles has been doing so much better," she said, her voice lifting like the words tasted sweeter. "He has this new idea. A real one this time. You'll see. I'm so proud of him." I stepped inside, and the house hit me with the same combination of comfort and erasure it always had. The tree was up, the ornaments were the old ones, but the walls still told the same story. Framed photos of Miles in sports uniforms, Miles at graduation, Miles in a suit at some networking event he probably didn't even enjoy. I didn't see a single picture of me. Not one. There was one childhood photo where I existed, but only technically. Miles centered on a shiny new bike, my mother's arm wrapped around him, and me blurred at the edge of the frame like I'd wandered into the shot by accident. I didn't feel hurt the way I used to. I felt clear, like someone had finally cleaned a foggy mirror. Denise called toward the living room. "Miles, your sister's here." And I heard the lazy shuffle before he appeared. He was stretched across the couch like he paid rent, one sock on and one sock off, beer in hand, watching football with the volume too loud. He muted the TV and stood up with a grin that never reached his eyes, looking me up and down like he was inspecting something he didn't respect. "Well, look who it is," he said, and it was the same tone he'd had since we were kids, half amused, half dismissive. "Still single? Still buried in your little app thing?" Denise watched my face like she was waiting for me to play the old role and laugh it off. Make it easy for everyone. I smiled politely. Good to see you too, I said, because I wasn't there to fight. I was there to observe. Within 10 minutes, Denise had already handed me a dish towel like it was my natural place to be useful. Can you help with the salad? She asked, and she said it like we were a happy little team, like she hadn't spent decades making sure I stayed in the background. She poured herself wine, then poured Miles a glass like it was automatic, like her hands did it before her brain even had to think. For me, she pointed at the sink. Water. It was such a small thing, but that's how favoritism lives. It doesn't always scream, it just repeats. I chopped vegetables while Denise and Miles talked about his big plan, some new business idea he explained like a man presenting a masterpiece, and Denise nodded along like he was already successful. No one asked where I lived now. No one asked if I'd flown in. No one asked what my days looked like, what my work actually was, what I'd built. It was like I hadn't aged at all in their minds. I was still the quiet one, the helper, the extra chair at the table. And what surprised me was that I didn't feel desperate to change it anymore. I felt almost detached. Like I was watching a play I'd seen too many times to be impressed by the acting. When Denise finally called us to the table, my body reacted before my mind did. My pulse lifted, my shoulders tightened, because my nervous system still remembered what it meant to sit at that table and wait to be ignored. The seating was the same as always. Miles at one end, Denise close to him, me off to the side like an afterthought. I sat down in my old spot, and I let myself really take it in. The laughter that always circled around him. The way Denise passed him food first. The way she watched his face while he talked. Like she needed his approval to breathe. Miles launched into his idea. Something about an online sports gear store, a wide-open market. All the usual words people use when they want to sound like they're already winning. Denise kept saying things like, I told him I'd help. And she said it like a proud announcement, like she was still investing in him the way she always had. My name barely entered the room. I could have been a centerpiece. Then Denise finally turned to me, and her tone was the same tone she used when a cashier asked if she wanted a receipt. So, Nora, she said, cutting into her turkey, you're still doing your computer job, right? Still working on that app? I looked at her and felt something in me settle. Not anger, not sadness, just certainty. I set my fork down and kept my voice neutral. Yeah, I said. Still working on it. She smiled, relieved, because that answer meant she didn't have to ask anything else. As long as you're paying your bills, she said, like that was the highest bar she'd ever imagined for me. Miles smirked into his glass, enjoying the moment the way he always did. She's fine, Mom, he said, and then he looked straight at me with that same smugness he'd carried since childhood. Still wasting your time on that worthless company of yours? And there it was. The word that had followed me like a shadow. Worthless. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I didn't raise my voice. I just let the silence sit for one beat longer than normal, long enough for the room to notice I wasn't playing along. Then I shrugged, like I was commenting on the weather, and I said, Actually, I sold it. If you want to understand why I could sit at that table and say, I sold it, like it meant nothing, you have to understand what it took for me to become the kind of person who stopped asking for permission to exist. I didn't grow up with the kind of family dynamic where love was shared evenly, like a normal meal passed around. In our house, love was an investment strategy, and my mother had decided early who was worth pouring into. Miles was 5 years older than me, and from the beginning he wasn't just my brother. He was the centerpiece, the child she spoke about like a prophecy, the one relatives clapped for before he'd even done anything. I learned that reality when I was little, young enough that I still believed adults were fair. I remember being 8 years old, standing near the kitchen doorway with a cheap cup in my hand, watching his birthday unfold like an award ceremony. Denise had dragged a brand new bike into the yard, shiny enough to look expensive, and the neighbors actually came out to watch him ride it like it was some symbol of his future. People said things like, he's going places. and my mother beamed like she'd already won. She hugged him tight, whispering how proud she was, like the entire world was lucky to witness her son. I was a few steps behind in an old shirt that didn't fit right, and nobody asked me to stand in the photos. Nobody even noticed I wasn't in them. That was the first lesson I can remember clearly. In our family, Miles wasn't just loved, he was celebrated. And I was tolerated. His birthdays were parties, themes, balloons, weekends built around him. Mine were whatever my mother could fit in between whatever she was doing for him. Usually a store-bought cake, a couple candles, and her apologizing like I was supposed to be grateful she remembered it all. One year, for his graduation, they took him on a big trip. One of those once-in-a-lifetime gifts that was really just proof of how far she was willing to go for him. For my milestones, I got envelopes of cash left on the counter like payment. When he reached school age, Denise fought to get him into a private school she couldn't really afford. He had crisp uniforms, brand new shoes, tutors, sports, music lessons, summer programs that cost more than our car. I went to the local public school with peeling walls and textbooks older than I was. The difference wasn't hidden. It sat right in the open. And when I was young enough to ask why, Denise would pat my shoulder in that way that felt gentle until you realized it was dismissal. She'd say, "Miles needs more stimulation. He's really smart. He has so much potential." Then she'd smile at me like she was doing me a favor and add, "You're fine, Nora. You'll be fine." At first, it sounded like faith, like she believed I'd be okay. But after a while, I understood what it really meant. "You'll be fine," was her way of saying, "You don't require effort." It was her way of justifying why she could pour everything into him and still feel like a good mother. My father was there technically. He worked long hours at a finance job and came home tired. The kind of tired that makes you passive. When he was around, he let Denise run the house because it was easier that way. She made the decisions. She controlled the money. She managed the family narrative. And I learned early that the hierarchy didn't need to be spoken to be enforced. Miles at the center. Denise orbiting around him. My father on the sidelines. And me. Somewhere on the edge, as long as I didn't make noise. By the time I was 12 or 13, I stopped asking for things because I had already learned what the answer would be. If Miles wanted something, the answer was yes. If I wanted something, the answer was a sigh and a delay, and eventually the kind of maybe later that meant never. I stopped running into the living room with my test scores because she never looked up long enough to really see them. She was always emailing one of Miles's teachers, driving him to practice, budgeting for his next opportunity. When I needed something as simple as extra books or supplies, she made me justify it like I was asking for luxury. So I figured out how to need less. I learned to do things myself because relying on them felt like begging for scraps. I started teaching myself basic life skills from videos online, not because I was trying to prove anything, but because I knew no one was coming to rescue me. In middle school, I took small shifts at a cafe near school, washing dishes, wiping counters, doing whatever they'd let a kid do, and I saved every tip. That money became my first second-hand laptop later on, and I still remember how heavy it felt when I carried it home, like I'd finally bought myself a piece of freedom. I wasn't angry all the time back then. That's what people assume. That neglected kids grow up furious and loud. I wasn't. I was quiet, observant. I started noticing every small moment that confirmed the truth, and I stored them away, not as a list for revenge, but as proof that I could never build my life on them. At dinner, the conversation always belonged to Miles, his games, his grades, his dreams. I was there, but I wasn't the story. I was the extra chair. And somewhere in those years, something inside me adjusted like a switch flipping. I stopped trying to be chosen, and I started designing a life where being overlooked wouldn't destroy me. I didn't know it at the time, but the role I was carrying, the self-sufficient one, the low-maintenance one, the one who made it easy for everyone else, was slowly turning into something else. It was turning into endurance. And endurance, when you stop wasting it on the wrong people, becomes power. The older I got, the more I realized the problem wasn't that my mother didn't notice me sometimes. The problem was that she had built a system where I existed only when I could be useful, quiet, or convenient. It didn't matter how well I did in school, how responsible I became, how little trouble I caused. In her mind, Miles was the investment, and I was the reliable background. He was the child she needed to believe in. I was the child she assumed would survive without her. And because I did survive, because I adapted, because I learned to do things alone, she used that as proof that she was right to give me less. That's how favoritism stays clean in a parent's head. They don't say, I love one child more. They say, this child needs me more. They say, this one will be fine. They say it with a smile like it's a compliment, like they're blessing you with strength. But what they're really doing is handing you abandonment and calling it independence. The pattern showed up in hundreds of small moments that would sound petty if I listed them out loud, which is exactly why it works. People don't take death by paper cuts seriously until they see the scar tissue. When Miles needed something, it happened immediately and without debate. A new laptop, extra tutoring, a club fee, a weekend trip, an internship suit, a replacement phone because he needed it for networking. Denise didn't just provide, she overprovided. She gave him upgrades, cushions, second chances, and then called it support. When I needed something, even something basic, she treated it like negotiation, like I was asking her to choose me over him, when all I was ever asking for was to be treated like I existed. I learned to lower my voice before I even spoke. I learned to ask in a way that didn't sound like asking. It's okay if not. Don't worry about it. I can figure it out. I said those lines so often they became my personality. I didn't even realize I was doing it until one day I was 17, and my teacher offered me a chance to attend a weekend workshop that would have helped with college applications, and the fee wasn't even expensive, but my mother still looked at me like I'd asked for a vacation. She didn't say no directly. She did something worse. She sighed and asked if I really needed it. Then the same week, Miles mentioned he wanted to try some new program, and she found the money without blinking. That's the moment I stopped believing the family had limitations. The family only had limitations for me. My role was predictable. I was the one who filled the gaps. I was the one who didn't demand anything. I was the one who helped without being asked. If Denise needed someone to watch the house, I did. If she needed someone to clean up after a party for Miles, I did. If she needed someone to run errands while she focused on him, I did. And she liked me best when I was useful and silent. I could feel it. Her mood toward me improved when I made her life easier. The second I needed attention or space, her patience ran out. It was subtle, almost polite, which is what made it so hard to accuse. When your mother isn't cruel out loud, when she isn't screaming or hitting or calling you names, you start questioning your own reality. You start thinking maybe you're dramatic. Maybe you're jealous. Maybe you're ungrateful. And that was the trap. The pattern wasn't loud enough to be called abuse, but it was steady enough to shape my entire nervous system. I learned to sit on the edge of rooms. I learned to wait for conversations to include me, and then stop waiting when they never did. I learned to eat dinner listening to them talk about Miles like he was the only future worth discussing. I learned to celebrate myself quietly, because when I tried to share good news, it landed like a nuisance. If I came home with an A-plus test, Denise would give me the same quick smile she'd give a stranger's baby photo. That's nice, honey. Then she'd go right back to Miles's schedule, Miles's needs, Miles's potential. She didn't hate me. That's the part that made it so confusing. She just didn't prioritize me. And over time, not being prioritized turns into not being seen. It turns you into someone who stops expecting warmth, stops expecting protection, stops expecting care. And people think that makes you strong. It doesn't. It makes you careful. It makes you quiet. It makes you stop reaching. That's how I became the easy child, the low-maintenance one, the one she could ignore without consequences. And the sickest part is that Miles learned this pattern too. He learned that the house revolved around him, that my mother's devotion was guaranteed, and that I was the extra chair who would always adjust. He grew up watching me accept less, and he interpreted my silence as permission. So by the time we were adults, the way he treated me wasn't even personal anymore, it was automatic. He spoke to me like I was behind him in the hierarchy because he'd never been taught otherwise. He could mock my interests, downplay my work, call my company worthless, and he felt safe doing it because he knew Denise would never correct him. In her world, his confidence mattered more than my dignity, and that's what finally made everything click for me. It wasn't just that I was overlooked. I was being used as contrast, as the proof that Miles was special, as the quiet sibling who made him look brighter. I was the soft landing that made everyone else's ego feel stable. And once I saw that clearly, once I stopped romanticizing my mother and started watching her like a person with choices, the ache changed shape. It stopped being sadness and started becoming something colder. Not rage, not revenge. Just a private certainty that I would never again build my life inside a system designed to keep me small. That awareness didn't make me loud. It made me disappear on purpose. It made me withdraw my need for them the way someone slowly withdraws money from an account they know will eventually be emptied. I stopped sharing. I stopped asking. I stopped hoping. And the more I stopped, the more obvious it became how little of my existence they had actually been holding onto in the first place. By the time I left for university, I didn't do it with drama. I didn't slam doors or make speeches about how unfair everything was. I just went. Quietly, like someone who had learned that begging for love only teaches people they're allowed to ration it. I got accepted into a solid program in Rainier City. Computer science, partial scholarship. And I remember sitting on the edge of my bed rereading the email until the words blurred, not because I thought it was some miracle, but because it felt like the first door I'd ever opened myself. I walked into the kitchen to tell my mother, and she smiled at the screen like it was a weather update. "That's great, honey," she said, and before the warmth could even settle, she asked if I could help her proofread an email to one of Miles's professors. That was my confirmation. Even my escape was still just a pause between her focus on him. A week later, Miles got into an elite school and the house transformed into a stadium. Relatives came over. There were banners, champagne, photos, tears. Denise spoke about his future like it belonged to the whole family, like his success was a shared inheritance. When it was time for me to move, she hugged me at the curb, said she was proud, and drove off because she was running late. When it was time for him to leave, she flew with him, carried boxes up to his dorm, decorated his room, and posted an entire album online like she was sending a prince to his kingdom. That contrast could have broken me if I'd still been trying to earn her. But by then, something inside me was already shifting. I wasn't expecting fairness anymore. I was collecting information. I moved into a cramped apartment near campus with roommates who were loud and kind and broke like me. My scholarship covered part of my tuition, but not enough to pretend I had a safety net. So I worked. I took a job at a coffee chain a few blocks from campus and woke up before sunrise, pulled on that apron, spent mornings smiling at people who didn't notice me, then rushed to lectures with caffeine stains on my sleeves. I'd sit in the library with a secondhand laptop that ran hot and slow, teaching myself extra material through free videos because the textbooks were expensive, and nobody at home was going to help. Most students were building social lives. I was building skills. And I didn't feel sorry for myself. Not in the way people expect. There was something strangely calming about knowing the rules. If I wanted something, I had to make it happen. No one was going to hand me an advantage, which meant no one could take it away either. That's when my emotional withdrawal really began. Not from school, not from life, just from them. I stopped calling Denise to share small updates because I already knew how the conversation would go. She'd listen in fragments and then circle back to Miles like gravity. I stopped telling her about my grades, my projects, my little wins. I stopped trying to feed her a version of me she could clap for because she'd already decided who deserved the applause. And once you stop performing for someone, you start hearing how quiet your life actually gets. I focused on the things that gave me that electric feeling of progress. The moment a line of code finally worked, the moment a concept clicked, the moment I realized I could build something from nothing without anyone's permission. The idea for my app didn't come from some flashy pitch deck, it came from exhaustion. I watched people around me burning out, skipping meals, pulling all-nighters, living like their bodies were disposable. I heard my roommates complain about feeling like zombies, about wishing something would remind them to take care of themselves, without feeling like a nagging alarm. One afternoon, sitting at a sticky cafe table between shifts, it hit me so simply it almost felt stupid. What if there was one clean, simple tool that helped people track the basics? Sleep, movement, food, water, and nudge them in a way that felt like a friend, not a lecture. I started sketching it in a cheap notebook. Rough screens, basic graphs, small reminders that sounded like texts instead of warnings. I didn't tell Denise. I didn't tell Miles. I didn't announce it like I'd been trained to do when I wanted attention. I just started building. Nights turned into routines. Work shift, class, instant noodles, code until 2 a.m, sleep, repeat. The first version was ugly but functional. I gave it to a few classmates, told them to be brutally honest, and they were. They tore it apart. They told me what sucked, what confused them, what they wanted. And instead of taking it personally, I fixed it. Over and over. Little improvements, little updates, tiny moments where I realized I could handle criticism without collapsing, because I'd been quietly handling dismissal my entire life. People began using it, not as a favor, not because they felt sorry for me, because it helped. A student told her boyfriend, a friend told a group chat. Someone left a random review that made me cry in a bathroom stall at work because it was the first time I'd felt seen by a stranger in a way my own family never managed. When the app made its first small amount of money, nothing impressive, but real, I stared at the numbers and felt something shift again, deeper. It wasn't about income. It was about proof. Proof that the thing I built with my own hands had value, and the more it grew, the more I pulled inward. Not in a depressed way, in a disciplined way. I stopped needing my family's attention because I was too busy creating a life where their attention wouldn't matter. When Denise called, it was still the same. She'd gush about Miles's networking events, his dreams, his potential, even when those dreams never turned into anything. One night, I tried to tell her about my app. Just a small update, 1,000 users, people actually using something I made, and she said the words she always said like a reflex. "That's nice, sweetie." Then she immediately started talking about a possible internship Miles might get because some professor liked him. I listened quietly, phone to my ear, and I felt that internal shift complete itself. It wasn't anger. It wasn't heartbreak. It was the moment I understood I was done offering myself to someone who only knew how to value me in comparison to someone else. I stopped bringing it up after that. I let them believe I was just doing computer stuff and scraping by. I kept my life small on the outside, not because it was small, but because privacy was the first boundary I'd ever been allowed to have. And while Denise and Miles continued living in the same hierarchy like it was permanent, I was already gone. Not physically, not yet, but emotionally I had already left their house. I had already stepped outside their orbit. The rest of the story, the money, the sale, the Christmas table, was just the moment they finally noticed the space I'd been quietly creating. The point of no return wasn't the day my app crossed 1 million users, and it wasn't the day the first serious buyer reached out. It wasn't even the moment I signed the final papers and watched a number appear in my account that looked unreal. The point of no return was quieter than that. It was a decision I made long before Christmas, back when Denise still thought my life was fine, and Miles still spoke to me like I was his little shadow. After university, I graduated early, not because I was chasing some inspirational story, but because I couldn't afford to stay longer than necessary. While other students talked about gap years and travel, I signed a lease on a tiny office space in Rainier City's tech district, a gray building with flickering lights and ugly carpet and a view of a parking lot. It was the first room in my life that belonged entirely to me. I filed paperwork, incorporated, opened accounts, moved into that space with two mismatched desks and a second-hand couch. My days became a grind so consistent it stopped feeling like effort and started feeling like identity. Mornings were support tickets and bug fixes. Afternoons were features. Nights were marketing tutorials and more code. I answered every review myself. I messaged users who quit to ask why. I begged a designer online to make the interface look less like something built in a basement. Slowly, the numbers climbed. People started sharing screenshots of their progress. Trainers asked to recommend it. Gyms asked for branded onboarding. I said yes to everything and built a simple paid tier. Nothing flashy. Just a few extra insights for a few dollars a month. When the subscription revenue finally looked like a real company instead of a hobby, I hired 2 junior developers. Kids like me. Smart, hungry, overlooked. We cramped into that tiny office, surviving on cheap coffee and takeout, pushing updates every week, watching something real take shape. And while all of that was happening, Miles's destiny started doing what it always did, collapsing the moment it required actual discipline. His first startup attempt died fast. He burned through a large amount of Denise's money, shut it down, and moved back home like it was normal to retreat into the same house that had always protected him from consequences. Denise called me crying, not about her own choices, not about the imbalance she'd created, but about how hard the world was for her son, how he just needed one good break. How she was worried about his confidence. She didn't ask what I was building. She asked if I could be understanding. She asked if I could be supportive. It was the same pattern, just dressed up in adult language now. And when she finally did ask about me, it came out vague and dismissive, like she was talking about a hobby someone does on weekends. "That app thing still going okay?" That's all she said. That was the space she made for me. I kept my answers short. Yeah, it's fine. I didn't mention the revenue. I didn't mention my team. I didn't mention the partnerships I was negotiating with real businesses. Not because I was hiding out of fear, because I already knew what would happen if I told her. She would either minimize it until it sounded harmless, or she'd try to turn it into something for Miles. And I wasn't willing to be used that way anymore. Around that time, a business development guy from a major tech company reached out to me about strategic options. The meeting was in a glass building that smelled like expensive coffee and ambition. I walked in wearing my only decent blazer, palms sweaty, trying not to look like a girl who still ate dinner over a laptop. They offered to buy my company for $50 million. 50. It was more money than my childhood brain could even hold. For a split second, I imagined calling Denise. I imagined her voice finally changing. I imagined her saying, "I knew you could do it," like she'd been secretly rooting for me all along. And then I listened to the rest of the offer. They wanted full control. They wanted to squeeze the app into something that made money first and helped people second. They wanted to turn trust into a funnel. I said no. My lawyers acted like I'd lost my mind, but that no was the first time I felt something that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with self-respect. I wasn't going to let someone else ruin what I built just because I'd been trained to accept scraps. Turning down that offer sent a message into the world that I hadn't even realized I was sending. If one big player wanted me, others would too. A venture firm reached out next. They didn't want to buy. They wanted to invest. I negotiated hard, took funding without giving up control, and the company grew faster than it ever had. New office, more hires, integrations with major wearable platforms, users climbing, revenue climbing. I signed for a modest penthouse with a view I still barely looked at because I worked so much. I still dressed the same. I still drove an old car. On the outside, I didn't look like someone with power, and that was intentional. Power is easier to protect when people don't recognize it. Then the offer that stuck came from a healthcare group. Bigger, quieter, and smarter than the tech giant had been. They didn't want to gut the product. They wanted to keep my team, keep the brand, and use their reach to scale it in a way that still made sense. They offered $150 million. Months of negotiation followed. Contracts, calls, numbers that made my head feel distant from my body. When I finally signed, I walked out of that meeting numb. After taxes, after paying bonuses to my team, after fees, I had roughly $90 million. And for the first time in my life, I realized something that should have made me feel triumphant, but didn't. I didn't feel like celebrating. I felt tired. Not because money is heavy, but because it forces you to finally face the story you came from. I didn't call Denise. I didn't call Miles. I called a therapist. Sitting in a quiet office, I said out loud what I'd never allowed myself to say, that being the invisible child doesn't just hurt, it rewires you. Therapy turned into months. I started donating quietly to mental health nonprofits, especially ones focused on women who couldn't afford care, because I knew what it felt like to need help and have nobody take it seriously. And somewhere in those months, I realized my anger wasn't the kind that wanted to scream. It was the kind that wanted closure, not the dramatic kind, not the cartoon revenge kind. The kind where you walk back into the place that trained you to be small and you watch what happens when you refuse to shrink. That's when Christmas started approaching, and I found myself looking at flights back to Rainier City. My therapist called it an experiment. "You're not going back to be loved," she told me. "You're going back to observe." And I understood exactly what she meant. I didn't want Denise's approval anymore. I didn't want Miles's respect. I wanted to see, with my own eyes, what would happen if I stopped protecting them from the truth. That was the point of no return. The moment I booked that flight, I knew the old dynamic was already dead. They just hadn't found out yet. When I told Denise I could come for Christmas, she responded like she'd just gotten back something she assumed would always be available. There was an eagerness in her texts that almost felt fake, like she was excited about the idea of me returning to the role I'd left behind. She didn't ask why I was suddenly free. She didn't ask where I was staying. She didn't ask anything that would require her to imagine my life as real and separate from hers. She just said, Miles would be there too, and she added that little heart, like she was sealing a pleasant family memory in advance. It told me everything. In her mind, the story was still the same. Miles was the center, she was the manager, and I was the extra piece that completed the picture when it was convenient. Even booking a hotel didn't register as a boundary to her. She didn't protest. She didn't ask. She didn't take it personally because to take it personally would require acknowledging that I might have reasons. And she was allergic to reasons when they involved her. That's the thing about people who benefit from a dynamic. They don't examine it. They just assume it's natural. Christmas morning, when I drove up to her house, it played out like she expected. The quick hug, the surface-level comments, the immediate pivot into Miles' updates. He's doing so much better. He's got this new plan. I'm so proud. Her voice had that same practiced shine, like she was trying to polish him in front of me, like my presence was a mirror she needed to reflect his worth. Miles acted like he was still the one with leverage, that crooked grin, the little comments. The way he talked about my work like it was a cute obsession that would never pay off, and Denise let it happen, because she always had. She watched him mock me the way you watch two kids tease each other, like it was harmless. Like the target wasn't always the same. She handed me a towel, put me in the kitchen, let me be useful. It was almost comforting to them, I could feel it. Like my return validated their world. Like the moment I walked through the door, the hierarchy snapped back into place, and they could relax. Denise poured Miles wine without thinking. She gave me water like I hadn't aged. She talked about his venture like it was already a success, like he was just waiting for the world to recognize what she'd always known. She even glanced at me at one point and said, "You know, I told him I'd help him get it going." With that tone that wasn't really asking for my opinion, it was asking for my agreement. Like I was supposed to nod along and confirm that of course the family resources should go to him again. Of course it made sense. Of course he deserved another push. I didn't react. I just listened. And I realized something that made me strangely calm. They weren't being cruel because they were angry at me. They were being careless because they believed I was still harmless. They believed I still needed them, still wanted a seat at their table badly enough to swallow whatever they handed me. That belief made them bold. It made them comfortable. It made them sloppy. At dinner, Denise passed food to Miles first, laughed at jokes that weren't funny, leaned toward him the way she always had, like the rest of the world could disappear as long as her golden child felt large. Miles launched into his plan with confidence he hadn't earned, something about an online sports gear store, a wide-open market, the kind of business idea that sounds impressive only if nobody asks for details. Denise nodded like he was presenting a blueprint for greatness. She kept saying things like, "He's been working so hard," and "This time he's serious," and "All he needs is a little capital," like she'd already decided she would provide it. And she had. She always had. The entitlement sat in the room like a fourth person. Miles wasn't embarrassed to talk about needing help because he'd never been trained to feel consequences. Denise wasn't embarrassed to offer because she'd built her identity around being the kind of mother who sacrifices everything for her son. And I sat there in my old chair, taking small sips of water, watching them repeat the same ritual as if the last 20 years hadn't taught them anything. When Denise finally turned to me, it wasn't because she was curious. It was because she remembered she was supposed to make a polite effort. "So, Nora," she said, cutting into her turkey, "you're still doing your computer job, right? Still working on that app?" It wasn't a real question. It was a checkbox. I answered the way I always had. "Yeah, still working on it." And she smiled, relieved, because it meant she didn't have to engage. "As long as you can pay your bills," she said. In that light tone adults use when they're talking to someone they don't take seriously. And Miles took that opening like it was his right. He smirked, swirled his wine, and said, "She's fine, Mom. She's got her little project." Then he looked at me, that condescending glint sharpening, and he said the line he'd been waiting to say all night, the one that made him feel bigger. "Are you still wasting your time on that worthless company?" Denise didn't correct him. She didn't flinch. She didn't even look uncomfortable. In her world, it was normal for him to talk down to me. It was normal for me to accept it. And in that moment, I could feel how sure they were. Sure that nothing I did mattered. Sure that Miles would always be the one worth betting on. Sure that I would always be the quiet sister who absorbed the disrespect and kept the peace. They thought they'd won because they thought the game was still the same. They thought they'd won because they didn't know the most dangerous kind of change had already happened inside me. I wasn't there to argue. I wasn't there to plead for space. I wasn't there to ask them to finally see me. I was there because I'd already built a life where their vision didn't define me, and now I wanted to watch what happened when I stopped shrinking to protect their comfort. Their confidence was almost gentle in how careless it was. Miles spoke like a king because he still believed he owned the room. Denise smiled like a woman who still believed her family story was intact. And I sat there, perfectly still, because I knew something they didn't. I knew the next words out of my mouth were going to change the atmosphere in a way they couldn't talk their way out of. And the moment I decided to let that happen, the old hierarchy was already collapsing. They just hadn't heard it crack yet. When Miles said worthless, I didn't feel the urge to defend myself. That urge had died years ago, from disuse. I just watched his face as he enjoyed the word, the way he always had. Like he was throwing something at me that he believed would land. Denise was watching too, not to protect me, but to see whether I would react in a way that disrupted the comfort of the table. The old version of me would have laughed politely, maybe made a small joke, maybe changed the subject. That's what they expected. That's what they counted on. But I wasn't there to make anything easy anymore. I let a beat of silence stretch out, just long enough for the room to feel it, and then I shrugged lightly, like the conversation had bored me. Actually, I said, calm, I sold it. The air changed so fast it was almost physical. Miles let out a short laugh like he'd heard a joke and didn't want to give me the satisfaction of taking it seriously. Denise froze with her fork halfway to her mouth, eyes flicking to me with a sudden, uncomfortable attention, the kind she never gave unless something threatened Miles's position. You sold it, Miles repeated, doing air quotes with his fingers, like he was mocking a child playing pretend. To who? Your roommate? I didn't smile. I didn't rise to the bait. A healthcare group, I said, and saying those words out loud in that house felt strange, like speaking a language they'd never bothered to learn. Miles leaned back in his chair, still smirking, still safe inside his assumption that I couldn't possibly have done something real without him knowing. Okay, he said, voice dripping with sarcasm. So what? You made what? A couple $100,000? Enough to move out of your shoebox? Denise was staring at me now, wide-eyed, as if her brain was trying to catch up to a reality she'd never prepared for. How much? She asked, soft, almost fearful, like she didn't want to hear the answer but couldn't stop herself. Miles jumped in, louder, sharper. Yeah, how much exactly? There was a challenge in his eyes, the same challenge he'd always carried, the belief that no matter what I said, he would still be above me. I held his gaze and did something I'd never done at that table before. I controlled the pace. I let the silence sit long enough to make them uncomfortable. I let them wait. Then I said it plainly, with no emphasis, no theatrical delivery, like I was reading a receipt. 150 million. Miles's jaw dropped so hard it looked like his face forgot how to function. Denise's fork slipped from her fingers and clattered against her plate, the sound sharp in the sudden quiet. Her skin drained of color like someone had pulled a plug. For a second, nobody moved. Then Denise whispered, "That's not funny, Nora." Her voice trembled like she was begging me to take it back, not because she cared about my feelings, but because she needed the world she'd built to stay intact. Miles snapped out of shock and lunged for denial like it was a life raft. "You're lying," he said. "Nobody pays that much for some stupid phone app. You're not even that smart." He said it with panic in his voice because the insult wasn't meant to hurt me anymore, it was meant to rescue him. I didn't argue. I didn't list my achievements. I didn't tell them what I'd sacrificed. I just pulled my phone out, unlocked it, and turned the screen toward them. I had my banking app open, not because I wanted to brag, but because I knew exactly how this would go. People who ignore you for years don't suddenly believe you when you speak. They believe numbers. Denise leaned in, eyes darting over the digits, lips moving as she tried to count commas, her expression collapsing into something between disbelief and shame. Miles grabbed the phone from her, hands shaking, scrolling like he expected a trapdoor to open, like he expected me to reveal it was a fake screenshot. When he couldn't find the lie, he snatched his own phone and started typing furiously, the way insecure people do when reality doesn't match the story they've told themselves. A few seconds later, I watched his face harden as he found the article. His glasses reflected the headline. He scrolled, muttering phrases under his breath, and I knew he was reading the same words I'd once read alone in the middle of the night. In silence, with nobody to call. A young founder, a health app, a sale for 150 million. My name, my face. Proof that I existed. When he looked back up at me, the smugness was gone. Denise's eyes were wet now. "Why didn't you tell us?" she whispered, as if I'd hidden something from them that belonged to them. "How could you keep something like that from your own family?" That was when something cold and clean settled in my chest. Not anger, not cruelty, just clarity. Because in that sentence she wasn't apologizing, she wasn't reflecting. She wasn't asking how she'd missed my life. She was accusing me of withholding access. She was reacting like someone who'd just learned they were locked out of a room they assumed they owned. I exhaled slowly, almost amused. "You mean the way you kept everything for Miles?" I said, and my voice stayed calm, because I wasn't saying it to hurt her. I was saying it because it was true. I named it, one piece at a time, without raising my volume. The private school, the trips, the money she handed him for his failed startup, the way she forgot my birthdays or treated them like chores, the way she flew out to help him settle into his dream while I moved myself with secondhand bedding and no photos. Denise's mouth opened and closed. She tried to form the old defenses. That's not fair, she managed. We did our best. We supported you. We always... No, I cut in, sharper than I meant to, but still controlled. You supported him. You invested in him. You built your whole life around him. You told me I'd be fine, and then you acted like that meant you didn't have to try. Miles slammed his fist on the table, making the glasses jump. So what? He shouted, voice cracking. You think you're better than us now? You think money makes you special? You're still the same weird little sister who ate lunch alone. You just got lucky. I stood up slowly, and the room felt smaller. My hands were steady. My heart wasn't racing. It was almost peaceful, like the moment I'd been approaching for years had finally arrived, and I was simply stepping into it. Luck didn't write a single line of code, I said. Luck didn't answer customers at 3 a.m. Luck didn't refuse a $50 million offer because it wasn't right. Luck didn't build my life. I did. Then I looked at Denise. Really looked at her, and for the first time I saw her without the haze of childhood hope. She looked small, shaken, like the foundation she'd relied on had cracked straight down the middle. I spoke softly, and that softness landed harder than shouting ever could. You gambled everything on the wrong child, I said. And now you're angry because the one you ignored learned how to win without you. Denise reached out like she was going to grab my wrist, like she could physically pull me back into my role. Nora, wait, she said, voice urgent. We can talk about this. Maybe you could... help. Help your brother. Invest. We're family. There it was. Not an apology. Not accountability. Just an instinctive reach for my resources, like my success was finally valuable only because it could be redirected into Miles. And that was the exact moment the revenge became real, even though I didn't lift a finger against them. Because my revenge wasn't yelling. It wasn't humiliation. It wasn't taking anything from them. It was refusing to give them what they'd trained themselves to expect. I picked up my phone, slid it into my pocket, and I shook my head once. I did stick together, I said quietly. For years. You just never noticed. I pushed my chair back, the legs scraping the floor with a sound that felt like the end of something. The Christmas lights blinked in the window behind them, reflecting off their stunned faces. I looked at them one last time, not with triumph, not with pity, just with finality. Enjoy dinner, I said. Merry Christmas. And then I walked out. I left them sitting there with their turkey and their hierarchy, and the silence they'd always expected me to swallow. I didn't slam the door. I didn't cry in the driveway. I didn't turn around to see if Denise followed. I just stepped into the cold air and drove away, and in that moment, the value, access, and power they'd assumed would always belong to them quietly disappeared. The fallout didn't explode the moment I drove away. It didn't come as one dramatic phone call or some instant collapse. It came the way consequences usually do when people have spent years avoiding them. Slow, humiliating, and undeniable. That night, back in my hotel, I took off my shoes, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared out at the wet city lights through the window. I expected my phone to light up right away because I knew Denise. I knew Miles. I knew how quickly they reached for control when they felt it slipping, but nothing happened. The silence lasted longer than I thought it would, and for a brief moment I almost wondered if they were sitting at that table actually reflecting. Then morning came, and I remembered they weren't built for reflection. They were built for blame. The first messages were from Denise. Long texts that tried to sound loving while still accusing me. She wrote about family, about misunderstandings, about how hurt she was that I had embarrassed Miles. She didn't mention what he'd said to me. She didn't mention the years of imbalance. She focused on the part where her perfect story had been disrupted in front of her golden child. Then Miles chimed in, and his texts were shorter, sharper, angrier. He called me selfish, ungrateful. He said I'd turn my back on the people who raised me, as if raising me had been something they'd done with intention instead of something that happened while they poured themselves into him. I didn't answer. I didn't correct them. I didn't defend myself. There was nothing left to explain. A few days later, the next move arrived, and it was so predictable, it almost made me smile. A letter from a lawyer representing both of them, demanding money. Not a request, not a conversation, a demand. They wanted compensation for support they claimed they'd provided. Housing, food, education, the cost of raising me. $3 million. Reading it felt like watching someone put a price tag on a childhood they barely showed up for. It wasn't just insulting, it was revealing. That letter wasn't about need, it was about entitlement. It was them trying to convert me back into an asset they could extract from, because now they knew I had value. I handed the letter to my attorney and told him I didn't want drama. I wanted distance. He replied in a language colder than I could ever speak myself, polite and lethal. He declined. Then he attached a detailed breakdown of the family's financial history, pulled together with my accountant. Every major payment tied to Miles, private school, trips, tutors, checks for his failed venture, large transfers labeled as help, and next to my name, a clean, unmistakable zero. No investment, no tuition boosts, no extras, not even the kind of small support Denise liked to claim later when she wanted to look fair. Just nothing. At the end of my lawyer's letter, he added one more sentence that ended the fantasy quickly. If they pursued their claim, those records could become public. That was the line that did it. Because Denise didn't want accountability. She wanted control. And public records meant people would see the truth she'd spent years dressing up as doing her best. The next message from her was frantic and short. They were dropping it. Forget the lawyers. Let's just be family. It wasn't an apology. It was retreat. And once the money door closed, once they realized they couldn't bully their way into my life financially, the dynamic started collapsing on its own. Miles was already unstable before Christmas. He'd been living on borrowed confidence his entire life, confidence Denise had inflated by shielding him from consequences. My sentence at that table wasn't just embarrassing to him, it was an identity crisis. It forced him to look at the possibility that he wasn't the star. And people like Miles don't handle that kind of shift quietly. He drank more, he ranted, he spiraled, he started showing up late to his retail job, snapping at coworkers, coming home angry, blaming everyone else for the fact that his plans never materialized. Denise tried to soothe him the way she always had, making excuses, softening consequences, telling him he was misunderstood, telling him the world was unfair. But the world doesn't respond to Denise's mothering. The world responds to behavior. One day, Miles had a meltdown at work in front of customers. He yelled at someone who recorded it. The video ended up online in a local group where people recognized him because Miles couldn't resist telling anyone who would listen that his sister was rich and ungrateful. People connected the dots fast. A week later, he was fired. The new venture he'd been bragging about, the sports gear store idea, never really became anything more than talk and debt. He tried to fund it anyway. Credit cards? A small loan he didn't understand. A few desperate purchases meant to make him look legitimate. And when it started sinking, he did what he'd always done. He ran to Denise. And Denise did what she'd always done. She tried to save him. She refinanced the house. She drained what she had left. She poured money into the same hole and called it love. But this time, the hole was deeper than her resources. The safety net she'd spent years building for him finally tore. Within a year, the house I grew up in was sold, not as some planned decision, but as a desperate attempt to cover debts and stop the bleeding. Denise moved into a much smaller apartment. Her health started to falter. Not from tragedy, from stress, from denial, from living inside the consequences she'd avoided for too long. The relatives who used to hover around her, the ones who praised Miles and treated Denise like the proud mother of a future success story, started pulling away. People don't like being close to a collapse when they know they might be asked to help. And Denise, for the first time in her life, didn't have a shiny story to distract them. She had reality, and reality is quiet. That next Christmas, I wasn't in Rainier City. I wasn't at Denise's table. I was somewhere warm with a small group of people who knew me without needing to rank me. We swam, hiked, ate dinner overlooking the ocean, and I sent a large donation to an organization that helps women afford therapy. I didn't do it to prove anything. I did it because it felt like closing a circle, giving something I'd once needed without attaching it to anyone who would use it against me. The only message I got that day from my family wasn't from Denise or Miles. It was from a younger cousin. She'd seen an article about me and said my story made her feel less crazy for being overlooked in her own house. That message mattered more than anything Denise could have said. I told her she could call me any time, and she did. Over the following months, I became what I'd needed when I was 16. A calm voice that didn't dismiss, a person who listened, someone who could guide without controlling. That was the strange thing about karma. It didn't just punish my mother and brother, it also rearranged my life into something healthier. Months later, an envelope arrived at my office. It was a handwritten letter from Denise. Not a text, not a demand. Paper, like she was trying to make it feel serious. She wrote that she was sorry. She admitted she had favored Miles. She admitted she hadn't seen me. She said she wished she could go back. She said she hoped I could forgive her. She said maybe we could start over. I read it once, then I read it again. And I felt nothing dramatic. No triumph. No ache. Just a quiet recognition that the apology didn't change the past. It just confirmed it. I didn't frame the letter. I didn't tear it up. I didn't rush to respond. I put it in a drawer, because by then I had already done the only forgiveness that mattered. I had forgiven myself for not being able to fix her. I didn't send money. I didn't rescue them. I didn't step back into the system they'd built just because it finally hurt them too. Setting boundaries wasn't punishment. It was protection. And while Denise's world shrank, mine kept expanding. Not in a flashy way, but in the quiet, steady way of someone who has finally stopped trying to earn a place at a table that was never built for her. After Denise's letter arrived, there was a part of me that expected something, some delayed wave of emotion, some old ache rising up, some urge to run back and prove I was still the good daughter. That urge never came. I think people imagine that when the parent who overlooked you finally admits it, it unlocks a flood of relief. But for me, the relief had already happened months earlier. Quietly, when I realized I didn't need her to validate what I'd lived. Her apology didn't heal anything because the wound wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a pattern. And patterns don't disappear just because someone finally feels guilty. I kept the letter because it was proof of something I'd always known, but I didn't respond. Not right away. Because I wasn't trying to manage her feelings anymore. That was the biggest change. For most of my life, I'd been trained to take responsibility for everyone else's comfort. If Denise felt upset, I was supposed to soften. If Miles felt threatened, I was supposed to shrink. If the family felt tension, I was supposed to absorb it. That training runs deep. It makes you confuse self-sacrifice with love. But once I stepped outside of it, I could see how much of my personality had been built around making myself easier to ignore. I didn't want to live that way anymore. Miles tried reaching out a few times after everything started unraveling. Not in a sincere way, in a chaotic way. Sometimes he'd send angry messages accusing me of ruining his life, as if his life had been stable before I ever opened my mouth at that table. Other times he'd swing the other direction, acting like we could move past it, if I just helped him reset. The tone would shift within the same conversation, insults, then compliments, then guilt. It was the emotional whiplash of someone who'd never learned how to regulate himself without an audience. I didn't argue with him either. I didn't explain. I didn't try to convince him that the consequences he was living in were his own. Silence was the only response that didn't feed the cycle. And I knew from watching Denise for years that engaging would only give them another way back in. Denise sent a few more messages too. At first, they were careful, almost humble, like she was trying on a new personality she didn't know how to wear. She'd ask how I was, the way you ask a stranger. She'd say she missed me. Then, eventually, the old instincts would leak through. She'd mention how hard things had been, how small her apartment felt, how Miles was struggling, how she wasn't sure what to do, and I could see it clearly. She wanted a rescue without calling it a rescue. She wanted me to return to the role of support system, the role she'd never offered me, but now wanted from me because she was out of options. She never said, "I understand what I did." She said, "Look what's happening now." It was still centered on her, still centered on Miles, still focused on what I could provide. That's when I understood something that made my chest feel calm and cold in the best way. Love without accountability is just access. And Denise had spent my whole life treating love like access. Access to my time, my compliance, my forgiveness, my silence. The moment she wanted access to my money, it became obvious what she thought family meant. Family meant entitlement. It meant the right to take from me because she had given birth to me, even though she had spent years emotionally absent. And I wasn't going to let guilt reopen a door I'd finally closed. I didn't hate her. I didn't wish suffering on her. I didn't celebrate what happened, but I also didn't pretend it was my job to fix it. I stood outside the damage the way you stand outside a burning building you spent years trying to repair. At some point, you stop running back inside just because someone is shouting from the window. I poured myself into my new work. After the sale, I started another company. This one focused on mental health tools and AI-driven check-ins, the kind of systems that help people recognize patterns in themselves before they collapse. It wasn't a revenge project. It was a continuation of the same thing I'd always been drawn to, building structures that support people who don't have support. I started speaking at conferences too, not as a victory lap, but because I knew there were people sitting in audiences feeling invisible in their own lives, and I wanted them to understand that invisibility doesn't mean you're powerless. It just means you haven't found the right room yet. I told parts of my story in a talk once, carefully, without naming them, without making it a spectacle. And afterward, women came up to me with quiet eyes and said, "That was my house too." That mattered. That was the kind of connection I'd always wanted, not the shallow approval Denise used to ration. Meanwhile, the family back home continued shrinking into the consequences they'd created. Miles bounced between jobs. He blamed everyone. He kept searching for shortcuts because he didn't know how to build anything slowly. Denise tried to keep him afloat, but there was no more house to refinance, no more large safety net left. Watching it from a distance felt strange, not because it was satisfying, but because it was predictable. I had watched them build that cliff for years. I had watched them walk toward it with confidence, convinced gravity would never apply to them. And then, when gravity finally did what gravity does, they acted betrayed by the laws of reality. People asked me sometimes if I felt guilty. Friends, coworkers, even that younger cousin who called me for advice. They'd ask it gently, like they were trying to make sure I wasn't cold. I always gave the same honest answer. I didn't feel guilty for refusing to fund a system that harmed me. Boundaries are not cruelty. Boundaries are the minimum cost of self-respect. I didn't send money. I didn't offer investment. I didn't invite them to my home. I didn't let Denise turn my success into Miles's second chance. The only thing I did, quietly, was maintain a distance that let me breathe. And the more distance I kept, the more my life filled with things that didn't involve proving myself. I traveled sometimes. I built friendships that felt steady. I mentored younger women who reminded me of myself. Smart, tired, underestimated. And I realized something simple. The reason Denise and Miles felt like they were collapsing wasn't because I had done something to them. It was because I had stopped doing something for them. I had stopped being the silent support beam. I had stepped away, and the structure that depended on my compliance started shaking. That wasn't revenge by action. That was revenge by absence. And I stayed absent. Not out of spite. Out of peace. People like to imagine revenge as something loud, a confrontation, a dramatic reveal. A moment where everyone claps and the villain collapses in tears. That isn't what happened. What happened was quieter, and that's why it worked. I said one sentence at a Christmas table, and then I removed myself from a system that had spent decades feeding off my silence. Everything that followed wasn't something I orchestrated. It was just the natural result of Denise and Miles finally meeting the consequences they'd always been protected from. Denise lost the house because she had spent years treating financial sacrifice like love, and she poured it into someone who confused being adored with being capable. Miles lost his stability because he had never built any of it himself. And I didn't stand there smiling while it happened. I didn't call anyone to gossip about it. I didn't post cryptic quotes online. I didn't even feel the thrill people think revenge is supposed to give you. What I felt was a slow, unfamiliar quiet, like the world had finally stopped demanding that I perform. Denise's apology letter stayed in my drawer. I never used it as proof in an argument. I never waved it around to make her feel worse. I kept it because it reminded me of something important. She didn't change until the cost of not changing became unbearable, and that wasn't my responsibility. I didn't owe her a redemption arc. I didn't owe Miles a bailout. I owed myself a life where I wasn't constantly trying to earn space. The strangest part was realizing that the little girl who did homework alone at the kitchen table wasn't weak. She was being trained. Every ignored birthday, every brushed-off achievement, every "you'll be fine" disguised as love had built a certain kind of resilience in me. Not the loud kind, the kind that learns to survive without applause, the kind that builds in silence, the kind that doesn't need anyone's permission to keep going. When I look back now, I don't feel hatred toward them. Hatred would mean they still have a place inside me. What I feel is distance. A clean, final distance. Denise and Miles can keep their version of the story if they want. They can call me ungrateful. They can call me cold. They can tell themselves I changed. The truth is, I didn't change. I just stopped shrinking. And the moment I stopped shrinking, they finally saw how small their love had always been. I built a life where I'm not the extra chair. I built a life where I'm not waiting to be chosen. And I think that's the part that still stings for them, even more than the money ever did. Because it wasn't the sale that made me powerful. It was the fact that I walked away and never came back to beg. So that's where it ends. Not with revenge as a performance, but with revenge as a decision. I withdrew my value. I withdrew my access. I withdrew my loyalty to a system that never deserved it. And I left them with exactly what they had built. I didn't break the law. I didn't hurt anyone. I didn't even raise my voice. I just exited quietly and let reality handle the rest. And now, when Christmas comes around, I don't feel dread. I don't feel guilt. I don't feel the old ache of hoping someone will finally see me. I feel calm, cold, done.